Okay, welcome. My name is Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute, and I want to thank all of you for coming today for a discussion of campaign finance reform in New York State as well as in the nation. This is a fascinating topic. It's one actually that I did research back about a decade and a half ago with one of our panelists, Michael Malbin, and I believe we probably even have some copies of the book left over, Michael, from 1998 when we did work by probably boxes. It's an interesting topic area for research. The claims about the effects of campaign finance reforms run from those who believe that it's the only thing keeping us from having economic equality in America, to those who consider it to be often an incumbency protection act, to those who think that it probably doesn't make much difference one way or the other. So what I wanted to do, though, was to bring in some real experts, since at least since January, when during the State of the State message, when Governor Cuomo talked about proposing major campaign finance reform in New York State. And believe me, any change or any significant change is major reform in New York State when it comes to campaign finance reform. I thought we should bring together some experts for a real discussion of what can be done with campaign finance reform, what are the best approaches to it, what can we expect to come out of campaign finance reform. And fortunately, we've been joined together in producing this forum today with New York State League of Women Voters, and it's been a pleasure working with them. So I'd like to begin with thanking Laura Berman, and also Barbara Bartoletti, who will be speaking today, for working together on this, putting together this forum. I'd also like to thank Mike Cooper for doing a lot of work in putting this together, as well as Michelle Charbonneau. As I mentioned, the governor started the year with a proposal for public campaign finance reform, what he called real campaign finance reform, including voluntary system of public financing, lowering contribution limits, and in New York, they're among the highest in the nation. Pay-to-play rules, that is to say, lower, at least among other things, lower contribution limits for those who are doing contract work or other kinds of business with the state. And also improved enforcement, which Michael is an area that Michael and I put quite a bit of work in some years ago, and which I hear hasn't actually improved a great deal since then. Though not a lot has happened since then. There were some bills submitted in April in both chambers. In the Assembly, we had the Fair Elections Act, and in the Senate, the Campaign Finance Reform Act, both proposed. They too included public financing, including a 6-to-1 contribution matching formula. It's very similar to what we find in New York City, which has been running operating a campaign finance reform rules that are in many ways a model for many of those who care about campaign finance reform across the country. It is a method of actually trying to get more small contributors and small contributions into the political system. So what I'd like to do is at least get started with some opening remarks by all of our speakers. We're going to start with Adam Skaggs. Adam is Senior Counsel in the Democracy Program of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. And Adam would be particularly good in putting campaign finance reform into this broader context of political reforms that he's been dealing with at the part of the Brennan Center, which also deals with voting reform, judicial reform, and a number of other areas. Adam can speak both about sort of developments in the technologies at the national level, but also his thoughts on campaign finance reform in New York State. Then we're going to turn to Kostas Panagopoulos. Kostas is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for Electoral Politics and Democracy, and the Graduate Program in Elections and Campaign Management at Fordham University. Kostas is an expert in campaigns and elections, voting behavior, media and public opinion, campaign strategy, as well as campaign finance. And he can help us to see how campaign financing has changed nationally as well, also put in the context of the elections and the management of campaigns. Then we're going to turn to Michael Malbin. Michael is co-founder and executive director of the Campaign Finance Institute, as well as professor of political science at the University at Albany at SUNY. Now, he's also been one of the nation's leading scholars in the campaign finance area, and his Campaign Finance Institute, I'd recommend to everyone, is an extraordinary resource for anybody doing work in this field. CFI, by the way, for those who don't know about it, is a nonpartisan research institute in Washington, D.C. that publishes extensive reports on money and politics in federal and state elections. Today, Michael actually will be releasing a new report, copies of which are out there in the, and you may have actually picked them up, copies of which are out there in a table. Then I'm going to turn to Jeffrey Stonecash. Jeffrey is Maxwell Professor of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. Jeff's research has ranged widely over the years on electoral changes, political parties, legislative behavior, and other topics. But he's particularly good here as an expert, a longtime expert in New York State politics, going back to the 6th editions of Governing New York that he's published. The 6th edition, by the way, has just come out, and so it would be well worth getting. He would be particularly good at putting campaign finance reform in a New York State context. And then finally, we're going to hear from Barbara Bartoletti, who is the legislative director of the League of Women Voters in New York State. And the League, as many of you know, has a wide-ranging agenda to improve democratic participation in government in New York, and Barbara has been an eloquent spokesperson for how campaign finance reforms would fit in this larger reform context. She's been a member of the League of Women Voters since 1978 and legislative director for the League since 1988. She oversees all legislation of interest to the League and the state legislature and lectures statewide on government reform. So I will start off with Adam, and then we'll go through, and then after that I will pose some questions for conversation among the discussants. We're going to have short presentations, and then later we'll have Q&A from the audience. We'll have a fair amount of time for that, so please hold on to those questions. In the meantime, if any of you have any cell phones or anything else likely to go beep or make any other sorts of sounds like that, please turn those off right now. So thank you very much. Adam, why don't you get started?
Thanks, Tom. And I want to just start by thanking, first of all, the Rockefeller Institute and the League of Women Voters for organizing this event. And for having us all here today. It's a real honor and a pleasure for me to be able to engage in a conversation with such distinguished and accomplished colleagues here on the panel. As Tom mentioned, I'm going to sort of kick us off here by talking briefly about kind of the context for today's discussion, both in terms of the overall campaign finance regulation environment, particularly as reflected in the election cycle that we've just come through. And then also, I want to say just a few words about the constitutional jurisprudential guidelines that will guide some of the attempts to develop policy in this area in New York State, and sort of address a couple of the leading cases in this area and try and unpack a little bit what their implications are for reform efforts. Turning first to the 2012 election that we've just survived, one might say. I think it's obvious, anybody who's here in this room, I don't need to reel off statistics about the amount of money that was spent. I think anybody who's interested in this topic is surely aware that historical records about the overall amount of spending by the candidates, by outside groups calling themselves independent groups, shattered all the historical records. I think that's probably something we're all aware of without getting into a lot of details. Given how much money was spent, though, I want to address first a kind of a myth, what I think has been the sort of conventional wisdom that's been perpetuated just after the election was over, which is that, well, all this big money we were worried about, it was all supporting Romney, it was all going to the Republican side. They didn't succeed as much as some of the spenders hoped. Therefore, big money lost the election. And therefore, if big money lost the election, maybe all this hype, all this progressive fear-mongering about money in politics is something we don't need to worry about. And I think that's wrong on a number of different levels, that perception. First of all, I think it's just from the standpoint of, did big money win or lose? Did the folks pouring these huge amounts of money into the election win or lose? Well, there was plenty of money on both sides. So yes, some of the most publicized examples of gifts to super PACs, Sheldon Adelson's support for various super PACs, some of those donations were made in support of candidates who didn't win, but there's plenty of big money on the other side that won. Look at the Republican primary between the South Carolina primary, which Gingrich won, riding a wave of tremendous outside spending, and followed immediately by Florida, which sort of the tables turned, and Romney's outside support from his super PAC and others carried the day. In those cases, money was hugely important. Even on the presidential level, in the general election, while I feel like a lot of the media attention has gone to the super PACs on the Republican side, there was plenty of it supporting the president as well. The president's super PAC, or I should more accurately say the super PAC dedicated to electing the president, spent at least $65 million on TV ads. Those were hugely influential, both in sort of crafting the narrative about Bain and about Romney's background. And there's a relatively tiny number of trial lawyers, some financial services folks, and unions that drove all that money. So on the victorious side in the presidential race, you have a very small number of donors who wielded disproportionate influence in getting him elected and may well have disproportionate influence going forward. But of course, taking a step further back, the notion that we can assess the impact of money in our political system by looking at vote tallies based on election day is the wrong question to be asking in the first place. The influence that money plays in our system is not about simply counting ballots. It's about the influence on governance, and it's about policy development after Election Day as we go forward. And the fact of the matter is, you're given the current campaign finance system, a tiny sliver of the electorate is responsible for the vast majority of spending, and we may hear a little bit about that later today. But that group that's responsible for the lion's share of all the money flowing into the electoral system wields disproportionate influence after the ballots are counted, as policies are developed, policies are debated or not debated as government functions between election cycles. Already Politico is reporting, I think today or yesterday, that 3 governors who are vying hard for the Republican nomination in 2016, Governors Kasich, McConnell, and Jindal, have all gone and had meetings already with Sheldon Adelson out in Las Vegas in an attempt to, well, I won't try and characterize what their motivations were in having those meetings, but the notion that one individual is so powerful because he has the ability to spend so much money, and that already, 3 years, 11 and a half months out from the next presidential election, you already have sort of a parade, a succession of folks kissing his ring, then I think that shows the sort of disproportionate influence that particular spenders have in this environment. And of course, the influence of these special interests that have such disproportionate influence cannot be measured just by looking at, well, did a legislator vote yes or no on a particular bill when it came up for a final vote, and would they have voted yes, but they voted no because they were worried about these funders. It's felt on a variety of levels. What bills don't come up for debate? What hearings are called? What issues are sort of left out of the final legislation? So by the time you get to the final up or down vote on something, money has already, and the influence of a very small number of folks, magnified through lobbying and these other things, has already had its way. Looking at the final votes up or down on legislation is a totally imperfect way to assess what's really going on. And then, of course, the reality of this incredibly overwhelming outside spending is such that not only are elected officials going to be very careful about what decisions they make or what policies they support, but they're also going to know that if they make the wrong enemies, if they anger particular interest groups or individuals that have particular agendas they care about, they're going to be subject to an onslaught of this outside money. And so they need to start building up their war chests the very day after the election. And so the amount of energy, time, and effort that our elected officials need to spend raising campaign money as opposed to grappling with the issues that matter to the public, that's really where the deleterious influence of money in politics is felt. So where do we go from here? Well, we've already heard reference to some of the proposals here in Albany, modeled in particular after New York City's system. The Brennan Center has done extensive research on this, some on our own, some working with Michael and the Campaign Finance Institute to document some of the benefits of that type of a system. And we're going to hear a lot about whether such a system would be appropriate and feasible in New York State. What I want to just spend just a moment making a couple last comments on is the constitutionality of such a proposal. And to do that, there are 2 Supreme Court decisions that I have to mention briefly. The first is Citizens United. Citizens United, of course, has gotten a lot of press about what it did for corporations and their status as persons and what it did about corporate money. But I think the most important part of that decision is not anything having to do with corporations per se. The most important part of that decision had to do with the Supreme Court's conclusion that independent spending that was done by groups other than the candidates, could not lead to any corruption in government, and therefore essentially could not be regulated. And so the key takeaway of that decision is not whether it's corporations spending the money or not, but it is that we are now in a campaign finance environment where there are no limits, and there can be no limits until the Supreme Court takes a different approach to the amount of money that's coming in outside the campaigns. And that's a reality that means candidates, if they want to compete, are going to have to raise ever larger sums of money. At the same time that Citizens United sort of made the problem worse, made the amount of money being spent in politics even greater, the Supreme Court in another decision, which I'll call the Bennett decision out of Arizona, took a look at Arizona's public financing system and struck down a piece of it. It didn't strike down public financing. There are some folks who have said, well, isn't public financing dead? The answer to that is no. But it did say one piece of that program, which gave publicly financed candidates additional funds based on how much their opponents were spending, was unconstitutional. So in other words, the court said, you cannot give additional public funds to level the playing field, to help equalize opportunity as a result of what the opposition spends. Basically, what the court has concluded is that when we're trying to create possibilities of more political speech, when we're trying to give resources to groups or candidates to get their message out, we can't increase a candidate's ability to get his or her message out by decreasing the opportunities for others to engage in speech. Basically, you cannot level down the playing field. But what they have not said is anything about leveling up. The Supreme Court has never, and I would guess will never, say that creating more speech based on something other than an opponent's spending is problematic. It's not. And the First Amendment, as we all know, is designed to facilitate more speech, more political debate. And a program like New York City's, which is under consideration here in the state, does exactly that. Under New York City's system, public funds go to candidates to help them amplify their message and magnify their ability to communicate with others. But that's not targeted or triggered by opposition spending. It's private donations, small contributions from regular voters to candidates that triggers public funds to those candidates to magnify the voices of those small contributors. So I just want to make the point clear that the type of public financing that I think we use in New York City and that is under consideration here at the state stands on very firm, very solid constitutional ground. And there are a lot of policy reasons to recommend it as well. I'll stop talking now and let some of the other folks here on the panel discuss that. But I just want to close by making the point that what we're talking about here, the proposed reforms, are clearly constitutional, and they are immune from the sort of challenges that have struck other reforms in the area of campaign finance in the past. So I think I've gone over my limit, but thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Great. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here and part of the panel today, and I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute as well as the League of Women Voters for including me to talk about this important topic nationally and specifically here in New York State, I think. I want to put on the table for discussion just a couple of points before getting to the discussion and interactions here. I think that if there's a silver lining to be found in the vast amounts of spending in the 2012 election cycle, particularly by super PACs, it's that it has raised the level of awareness about campaign finance and campaign finance reform in the country to the point that I haven't seen in a very long time. Not only nationally, even internationally. I traveled pretty extensively during the election cycle to talk about it, and all over the world, people knew about these super PACs and the spending and the money, and I think many voters were preoccupied with it, and I think it got them to thinking seriously about campaign finance and potentially about campaign finance reforms. And I think that is one of the major obstacles that I want to talk about to seriously reforming campaign finance, which is the low levels, generally speaking, of awareness about campaign finance and specific proposals that are out there. And as a result, I think people have difficulty unless you're part of the conversation. I think generally speaking, the public is very poorly informed, and that has implications for reform efforts and reform movements. So I think that this is a huge opportunity created by, ironically, Citizens United and Super PAC spending to really leverage this moment in time to think seriously about reforming the system of campaign finance across the country. One thing that people have not talked as much about in this election cycle is the complete collapse of the presidential public financing system. And Michael has done a lot of research on this and talked about this 2008. But there really is no presidential public financing system of which to speak, and without serious reform, I think that it may as well not even exist. So I think that's something to think about. One reform option that we are here to focus on today is the possibility of public financing of elections. I think that that's something that for those of us who have followed campaign finance reforms closely over the years is a promising class of reforms for a number of reasons. I edited a book volume last year on public financing in American elections that Michael has contributed to, in addition to many other scholars, and one of the things that we really looked at in this volume, or the main purpose of the volume, really had two main goals. One was to showcase the huge variation across the country in the type of public financing programs that exist. There are lots of states that have public financing programs, but they're very different from each other. And I think one of the main obstacles to serious reform is that there's not necessarily a consensus about the optimal type of public financing program. Now, for those of us here on the panel, I think a popular option is the New York City model of public finance, but it's certainly not the only model. Even though it has many advantages, I think that we have to acknowledge that there are other models out there, and I think that the reform community could benefit not only in New York State but nationally from some type of consensus around the model that seems to be the most effective, because that's something you're always up against, which is this idea that, well, yes, we agree that public financing is a good idea, but what type? I mean, what would you adopt? And that has the potential to delay things and even to be an obstacle. The other potential obstacle is public attitudes about public financing programs. And here I will just briefly summarize some of the survey research that's been done over the past several decades on public financing. If you look at some of the public opinion data on public financing, there is considerable support for public financing programs. More often than not, majorities of Americans do support public financing in American elections, but the results get much more murky and less optimistic if you inform people that the tax money will be used to support those reforms. I think there we see much more hesitation on the part of the public to direct tax money to financing political campaigns, to the point that minorities of Americans actually support public financing when it's supported by tax dollars. So what's the problem? And this creates a very interesting obstacles. But I think one of the main issues as I look at this data is that I think the public is generally skeptical about spending tax money for any purpose, and the question that immediately comes up is, well, what would you take that money away from in order to put it toward financing campaigns? But I think part of the problem is precisely that there are low levels of information about what public financing programs would do. What would their effect be? And here, again, there is much less consensus in the scholarly research on this topic about what the impact of public financing programs would be. And so as we talk about public financing, it sounds great in theory and in principle, and I think many of us believe that it's a good thing for society, but we really do have to have very clear criteria against which to judge the impact of public financing. So we could look at, a number of indicators, and scholars have looked at things like candidate entry and what types of candidates would emerge if they had support from public financing programs, or how do candidates allocate time and attention and other resources in the presence of public financing versus not. How does it affect levels of electoral competition? Does it level the playing field between incumbents and challengers? What effects does it have on public attitudes about government in general, trust in government, or feelings of political efficacy? And then how does it affect behavior, things like participation and voter turnout? And I have to say that in the course of putting together this volume and in looking at the research on this topic, generally speaking, the evidence is mixed. There is not consistent evidence saying that public financing programs are achieving what we might consider to be the more favorable effects. In some cases, public financing appears to have no effect on these things, but in other cases, it actually seems to show perverse effects, even lowering levels of political participation and other things. So that's the last thing we want to do is make things worse than they already are, right? So I think we need We need to look at these effects much more closely and to find reliable empirical evidence of what kinds of what the impact of public financing is, so that we can speak confidently about the kinds of effects that of reform proposals like public financing would produce. And I think that if we are persuaded that those effects will be positive, then we can make a much stronger case to the public. We can sell it to the public a lot more effectively if we have that kind of confidence. And I don't know that we have that kind of confidence at this point, because the empirical evidence is quite mixed. And so I think we need to do as much as we can to find reliable evidence that will point us in a direction of advocating strongly for public financing reforms. And I think that that type of public information campaign and that selling it to voters in a way that persuades them that it will have positive benefits for society as a whole, I think is an important dimension of this debate across the country and here in New York State. So let me leave it there, and I'm happy to talk about specifics in the Q&A.
I needed to get up because the clicker was here. So, after all of that, am I coming through? Good, thank you. I'll pick up on both Adam's and Costas's points. This is a preliminary review of where candidates in the 2012 New York State elections got their money. They received. It's all funds reported through the pre-general report. The post-general report is due today, so obviously we couldn't even download, let alone analyze the results. But and there's no reason to expect a fundamental change between now and the post-general, except the party money should go up. Through the pre-general report, candidates running for New York State office for legislature got 8% of their money from people who gave a cumulative amount of $250 or less. 19% from people who gave $1,000 or more, 57% from non-party organizations. This is pretty much the same as the table looked for 2010 and 2008. This is what New York State numbers look like. Now, in case your eyeballs are a little bit shocked here, this is not weird for most states. New York is a little low in this column, but not really incredibly lower than others. In most states, most of the money comes from this bar, the 1,000 or more, or from this bar, the non-party. So to pick up on a point that Adam asked, this is a tiny sliver, how tiny? Now, I haven't counted the New York State donor list yet, although you're stimulating me to do so. But I'll tell you that in the last election, I counted all donors to all congressional candidates nationally. All donors to all House and all Senate candidates in the last election who gave a disclosed amount or more, 350,000 individuals, providing the bulk of the money. 300,000, do the math. That's not 1%. That's 1/10 of 1%. Okay? There's obviously, when candidates look at financial constituencies, they're not spending equal amounts of time with all people in their constituencies. They're spending much more time in, let's call it in boardrooms, than in neighborhoods. And that does, I do believe that has an effect on governmental agendas. Now, if you think that's an issue or a concern, is there anything you can do about it? Well, you can't, and this is just not Citizens United. You can't try to equalize power through restraints on speech. Contribution limits, none of those things can be done in the name of equalizing power. If you want to equalize power constitutionally, the only way to do it is to get more people to choose to exercise the power that they actually have, but are not exercising. So squeeze the top doesn't work. We already know what happens when you try that. People who are really smart and really rich know how to hire lawyers to tell them how to continue to try to stay engaged in the process legally. So it seems theoretically to make more sense to build up. Sounds feasible, sounds interesting. Does it work? Well, and here, by the way, I'm about to disagree with something Cost just says. We have unclear findings with respect to public financing, in part because we have lots and lots of goals and lots of different kinds of programs. But when you're really simple about a goal, and you measure one kind of public financing, we actually have a very clear and completely unambiguous finding. And that's with respect to matching funds. Do matching funds change the behavior of candidates who have to raise funds? The answer is really clear, really unambiguous. The answer is yes. Let's look. No, that's too early. That's New York State. Let's stick with New York City. We did the empirical work in New York City. There's really no question about this. Voluntary system, candidates who choose to opt out of the system are raising approximately 15% of their money from small donors. Candidates who stay in the system are getting nearly 40, and when you add the value of the public match, it's more than 60. More than 60% of participating candidates' money is derived from people who give small contributions, in that case of $175 or less, because that's the amount that's matched by the city. And it's not only that it's more percentage. There are more people in the system, many more people, and a study we did jointly with the Brennan Center, they don't come from the same kind of places. They don't look the same. You're talking about candidates who have an incentive to look in their neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are every bit as diverse as those candidates. You're talking about when you start overlaying, this is the work we did, we took districts of state assembly and city council. The candidates raise about the same amount of money. The districts are about the same size. They overlap a lot. 25 times, not 25%, 25 times more money comes from small donors in Bedford-Stuyvesant to the candidates running for city council than the people who represent the same neighborhood for state assembly. You're looking at about 20 times as much for Chinatown, 14, 15 times as much for South Bronx. It was African American, Asian, and Latino. Big, big differences, not minor percentages. Huge findings. So the question, and by the way, I've not seen these challenged anywhere. It's been peer reviewed. You can argue a little bit about a percentage point too or there, but not about the nature of these findings. Might the same sort of program work in New York State? Well, it depends how much you change the incentive and the behavior of the candidates. But this is the way the bar charts looked in 2010, because we were able to run the simulation with 2010 because the final 2012 numbers are not in. So it's about the same as the one I just showed you. A little more from the $1,000 and up because you're including the gubernatorial race and not just the assembly races. But after you factor in, take the donor pool that you have. Take the same donors, reduce the amount that they can give because of contribution limits, parse it out to the same candidates, match the small donor money that the same candidates have, assume the same candidates get a reasonable number of small donors. They don't have many now, so we doubled them just for the simulation. We actually brought them up to the same level as New York City's donors. Here's what the chart looks like. That's That's just the same donors. More donors, they look like this. Go back here. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like if there's no incentive effect. That's what it looks like if there is an incentive effect. Again, this is not in doubt. What's in doubt is how much of an incentive effect would it have, not will it have an incentive effect. Why did it happen? It happens because we're not relying on police. You're relying on providing incentives and rewards to the key messengers in the system, the candidates. As I said, well, what might be the downsides of this? Oh, actually, I frankly can't think of many. There are two that I've heard some people raise. One, candidates who say, oh my gosh, those people are going to come after me with independent expenditures, and I'm going to have less money than I used to have. Well, they might come after you with independent expenditures. Nothing you can do about that. But one thing I can say is that if you were to take the bill that was introduced in the last session of the Assembly and Senate, here's the number of candidates who would be hurt. Most generally speaking, almost none. Now, I do think you probably need to do some adjusting in some of the details of the bill of the Senate, but basically, almost all candidates are going to end up ahead, giving up their top dollar contributions and taking the matching fund instead. And we're not talking about they'll be ahead by a trickle tiny bit amount. This is an average of about $50,000 per candidate. They'll be ahead. Well, you might say, wait, $50,000 a candidate, welfare for politicians. It's going to cost a ton of money. Here's what it would cost. Depends how you configure the program. But somewhere between $1.28 and $2.11 per New Yorker per year. Now, as far as I'm concerned, first of all, is that an appropriate use of public money? Let's talk about why it's not welfare for politicians. This is not a flat grant. This is not, you could argue that certain forms of public funding are. This is a program that is designed to and is known to have the effect of empowering average citizens. Isn't it appropriate use of public funds to engage citizens in their democracy? Not to suppress other people, to engage. Honestly, I can't imagine a more appropriate use. That's not a finding of empirical scholarship. I'll put that out there as my personal opinion. That's what I think. I also think that it would be highly surprising to me if spending $40 million a year on this kind of program would not produce at least $40 million a year in budgetary savings in other kinds of programs that are put in place because contributors ask for them when you're looking at a $110 billion budget. I just can't believe that this is not a net saver. But let's say it's a net loser. It's a net loser of $2 per person. That's it. I really think the big thing to say about this, and Costas is absolutely right about this, not all programs that carry the label public financing are the same. Not all serve the same objectives. What this one is about is creating a lever for citizens to get back. Now, again, what are is this a feasible idea? As I said, the bulk of the money comes from 0.1% of the population. If you look at how many people actually participate now, in the typical state, New York State is much lower. The typical state is less than 2% of the adult population. New York State, you're talking about 0.5%, way down at the bottom of the list. It really doesn't take the kind of shock to the system that changes voter turnout. To me, that's the wrong measure. Of course, people who give money turn out. The question is whether more people get engaged in the system in a way beyond turnout. And I would argue I'll give you an example. President Obama had 4 million donors. $4 million donors is 2% of the adult population of the country. If 5%, 7% of the adult population of this country got involved in a way they're not now, politics would be changed.
I knew I didn't belong here. And now it's even clearer to me that I don't belong here. I'd like to do 3 things. One of them talk about money, the role of money in campaigns, what we know about what it does. I think the really important matter about what does money do to the process of making decisions, and then what we're likely to get out of politicians in response to these proposals. And let me do a little disclosure first. I am presented here as an academic, but I did polling and analyses for candidates for both sides for 25 years, so I took a lot of their money. So you may make your own judgments about that. I think all these concerns are very legitimate. I'm going to offer some cautions, though. First of all, let's talk about the role of money in campaigns. I think we all begin with a very simple model about how money matters. We assume that, first of all, that elections or campaigns that are closer are ones that create more responsive politicians. So we look at the results and we see that the greater the amount of money spent, the closer the elections tend to be. So we worry a great deal that, geez, we've got to provide more money, so there'll be more spending for challengers, so we'll have closer elections, because that'll create more responsiveness, all right? You know, almost all those studies, I think, are pretty bogus. They begin with after-the-fact analyses, and they assume that the money caused the outcome. Anybody who's ever worked in campaigns knows that the closeness of elections draws the money. It's not, everybody does endless polling, looks at which races in the state are close, and then the ones that are close, the money is assigned to them. It is not that the money causes the problems. When a candidate or an incumbent gets in trouble because they have not been responsive enough, then everybody knows it, everybody decides, let's go after that person, find a good challenger, spend the money, and it will make it close. I might note we have very, very few studies that track how money matters during a campaign. We have these after-the-fact things. And I have been in campaigns where it mattered a lot. I've been in campaigns where it didn't matter at all. The amount of money spent didn't seem to matter much. I might say the legislative campaign committees are remarkably good at moving money around to get to challengers who they think are viable. So if an incumbent's not doing their job, don't worry, there will be a challenger who will be funded. So I don't think it's quite as clear as a lot of people make it sound that we know what money does during campaigns. That doesn't mean it's not bad. I'm not sure we know as much as is often talked about. Now let's go to the process about what does it do to the process. Again, I take it as a very serious matter. There are lots of reasons to worry about the impact of money when decisions are actually made. But I would note 3 things here real quick. One of them is that anyone who followed the presidential campaign, I think, was very, very interested in how little movement there was during the campaign. And the only time there really was any movement is when a candidate did something significant. When Romney appeared on the first debate and looked like he wasn't a wild-eyed, 5-armed wacko, a lot of people said, 3 or 4% he said, I'll move from Obama to him. That wasn't due to money. I think what's interesting about the fear of money in moving election outcomes is this. I think when we were 20 or 30 years ago, we were undergoing a long-term realignment. There were lots of people who were split-ticket voters, there were more independents. There are fewer now. I think we've moved into a world where, as you watched during this last campaign, there were about 46%, 47% on each side that made up their minds very early. And we were talking about a very small percentage of people who were in any way being the target of all this money. I think here's what is the strange paradox of now, is that the very polarization that has made it possible for people like Karl Rove to go out and raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and he can do that because everyone's so vehemently opposed to each other that he can raise money out of, that what it has done is that very ability to raise money has also made that money less effective. Because lots and lots of people have made up their mind, and they don't care how much you spend. They really have decided, all right? The best line I heard during the campaign was a woman, a very elderly woman in Ohio, who said, you know, I'm ready to see ads about Viagra. She said, I'd rather see an ad about an erection than this election. I thought that was a great line. So I think a lot of people have really, they don't move as much as everybody says. Now then two other things I think are really interesting about this process. Everybody worries about money in Washington, and there are lots of books coming out now that argue that the rich are controlling the process in Washington. I would just note two things. One of them is that the top 10% now provide 70% of all the federal income tax revenue. All right? If you go to that 10% and tell them that they are terribly influential and they're running the process, they'll go, huh? What do you mean I'm running the process? The percentage of the federal income tax revenue that's coming from the top groups is going up. Now, I know they're making more money and all that, but nonetheless, it's not quite so clear. And at the same time, the welfare state keeps expanding. And so if you look at the outcome in Washington, I don't think it's so clear that big money is driving the process. On Wall Street, yes. I don't think there's any doubt that Wall Street has enormous influence because they need their money in campaign contributions. But I'm not sure it's as simple as everybody seems to presume right off the bat that they're controlling that much. Now then let's look at New York. You know, in New York, everybody worries about the contribution limits and says that there is enormous influence from the well-to-do. I would note that if you go to the Business Council and ask them, are they influential in the state, they will immediately say this is the most regulated state in the United States, and we have the highest state and local taxes in the United States. And they'd say, it's true, all right? And they'd say, are we dominating the process? They would say, we are trying to make the case that the state is losing population and not growing as much because of the high taxes and the regulation. So I only just throw those as cautions. I'm not sure it's as clear as everybody says that money is driving the outcome. Now let's go to politicians. You know, I think it's a wonderful effort. I would be in favor of public financing, but I think you ought to anticipate what the politicians are going to do. Politicians, I think, are facing a political context which is changing, which makes them more needy for money, more worried about raising money, and more resistant to making change. And the political context is changing is the role of the media. In this state, there are more and more newspapers that are shrinking. There's less coverage. I live in a city where we're now going to go to a newspaper that is Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Every politician knows one thing, that their ability to get their message out and get regular coverage is diminishing. And they know they approach an election now with one simple reality. The electorate knows less about them. They need more money. And they are terribly worried about an ad that's run that says they did some horrible, awful thing that may not quite be accurate, but will have a powerful impact. And they know they're going to have to stockpile money to be ready for those attack ads. So I think if you look at politicians and you say, oh, they're all just a bunch of greedy incumbents who want to stay in office, well, they might be. But you know, that's not a bad thing in America to have people who want to get reelected. It's not a bad thing. I might note that I think that there is also this reality that their political context is changing, and if I were them, and if I were working for them, I don't do it anymore, but if I were working for them, I'd tell them to resist like hell. Because the more they can raise, the safer they're going to be, the more they have money to present their case and to ward off challengers. So I don't mean to end that on a discouraging note, but I don't think they're probably going to be very compliant.
Well, right off, I would disagree with Jeff, because I think he definitely needs to be here, and he always tells us a little bit about reality, and he always adds something that I learn from. So I'm glad you're here, Jeff. As I'm glad all of us are here, because there are some good and bad things about being the last one on the panel. The good thing is that a lot of what you might want to say has been said, so it doesn't mean you have to go on so long. And for anyone of my colleagues who knows me, the other good part of this is I don't get to talk as much as I usually do. So, but I'm also going to introduce something new, and I have a clicker here, I guess. Thank you. And right up front, I want to at least start with telling you why the League has done this paper that we have come out with, and why we are educating the public, because I think what many of my colleagues here today have said is that, legislators do internal polls, and they also know, campaign finance reform, if you put it out there to the voters on a survey, you end up getting it down somewhere around 14. After you've talked about the reform of health care and education funding and all of the other things that even guns that people are concerned about, you get down to 14. So the League is in the business of making sure that we get as many people to participate in our democracy as is possible. And so this is an issue that we are trying to educate the public, because until you educate the public to connect the dots, you are going to have it down on 14 on surveys that legislators also do, internal surveys, and therefore you're not going to be able to apply some of the pressure that Jeff talked about needing to apply, because legislators innately, every legislator, doesn't matter what party they are, they do not want to change the status quo, because the status quo, when you're talking about elections, works for them. It's how they got elected, and it's how they think they can stay elected. So they do not want to do this. It is our job to make sure that the public is well enough educated if indeed we want to change a system that I think everyone in this room recognizes is a broken system. So the League, not only have we put this paper out, and I think it was out on when we came in, the white paper, and please all of you take it. Use it, give it to your neighbors, your friends, and I also wanted to say, because our executive director will kill me if I don't, on our website is this entire paper. You can go to our website and it's right there under, I believe, education probably, or advocacy.
Homepage.
Homepage, right on the homepage. But we are also doing, and have already done some, about 30 to 35 forums across the state where we have had exceptionally good attendance by the public who really wants to learn, especially since this most recent election, they want to learn about campaign finance reform. So we are doing our part to educate the public and connect those dots. I think I'm supposed to do this. There you go. 4 pillars of campaign finance reform. I'm even going to try this. You have, for the League, you have what we consider to be our contribution. Do we, and have we always supported public financing? Absolutely. We have lobbied for public financing since actually when I first came onto the board as the legislative director. We've been doing it every legislative session since. I think my colleague Russ Haven and I have been on a road show to do this throughout the state. I don't know how many years ago it was now. So we have always supported public financing. However, and I think many of my colleagues today have mentioned how the public perceives, and I think someone even mentioned, it may have been Michael, welfare for politicians. Unless you are going to have accountability of a public financing system, you are not going to get public buy-in. And so as effective campaign finance regulation, we have some pillars that we think, including public financing, that is necessary for campaign finance regulation. And I guess I would start with this, saying that, and I'll show, let's see if I can go forward, I will show you a graph coming up of exactly the disproportionate, and I think everybody probably knows that in this room, the disproportionate campaign contribution limits in this state. Of the 39 states that have campaign finance laws, our contribution limits are the highest, our enforcement is the most lax. So what our position has been for decades now, as far as reforming the system, is reforming these current laws, lower contribution limits and loopholes. Does anybody here not know that there is an LLC loophole in this state that allows for the subsidiaries of corporations to just compound the $5,000 limit? Compound it and compound it. In fact, I think in a PowerPoint we use around the state, was it MetLife, I guess, has something like 159 subsidiaries, and then under that subsidiary, they also have sub-subsidiaries, and so you can see exactly how many above the LLC, what they could actually give to a candidate. And then, of course, our old favorite, restrict or ban housekeeping accounts. Everybody here probably already knows what a housekeeping account is. Doesn't have anything to do with cleaning supplies. It is what you can give unlimited amounts to a political party. They give them to the Democratic Campaign Committee in both the Assembly and the Senate, the Republican campaign in both the Senate and the Assembly. Everybody here in this room also knows that when you talk about power in the state Assembly and state Senate, it's money follows power and power follows money. So what we would like to do is either severely restrict or ban housekeeping accounts. Clarify, another old favorite, clarify restrictions on public use. My goodness, we go all the way back with personal use. Joe Bruno, people remember his pool cover that he paid for with campaign contributions, and we have football tickets and Christmas parties and flowers, etc. But my favorite is now what has become fashionable recently is paying for their criminal lawyers with their campaign contributions. A new twist that we have here in New York. And also, of course, we think this, because of all the things that Adam and Costas talked about as far as the legalities of Citizens United and going all the way back, you can't, in fact, now I guess anything goes as far as not restricting campaign contributions. So this heightens the absolute need to increase disclosure, which also, of course, does transparency. But increasing disclosure is something that we would not allow to fall off the negotiating table. And of course, another old favorite of mine, because I've been here for so long, and we watch the Board of Elections so closely, that putting in place independent and effective enforcement is a top priority for us, since I don't think I have to tell anybody in this room or the panelists who have dealt with the State Board of Elections, it is a bipartisan, gridlocked organization that, if you talk about campaign finance enforcement, this is a big state, lots of campaigns, lots of candidates, it has one enforcement investigator for the entire state to investigate any of what the non-compliant, shall we say, would be. So that's a real favorite of ours. How high are New York State limits and contributions? I'm not going to really spend much time on this because I think my colleagues have gone through this. But if you just take a look at what you can give the U.S. president, what you can give our state governor, kind of says it all right there. So we're going to move on to how high the New York State limits are by individuals. And again, in the state Senate, you can see, and the national average is in the lighter color, and you can see ours is wildly out of whack. I think enough said about that. We all know that. Okay, so what is wrong with New York State law? There is obviously no meaningful limits on contributions from corporations. As I said, they can have LLCs. We have for years now asked, whenever we are able to talk with the leadership, you must close the LLC loophole. Party accounts, I've already been there, but these are housekeeping accounts. Party monies can be used for overhead expenses. They're supposed to be used for get out the vote, taking care of the rent and the overhead expenses for the campaign committees. It has certainly leaked out now, and many of these housekeeping accounts actually go to help. They funnel them by transfers. They actually go to help a lot of marginal candidates. Effective oversight and enforcement, already talked about that. The Board of Elections, as well as they might, or as poorly as they might, depending on your judgment in your community, effectively administer elections. And I guess I won't even talk about New York City because that's a whole different ballpark. But even if you agree that a bipartisan, and it is constitutional in our state, that they should administer elections, and it should be the Democrats and the Republicans, you would have to look skeptically at the point that they do not have the staff, perhaps by design, they do not have the staff to correctly oversight and enforcement. And indeed, I think my colleagues from NYPIRG, Bill Mahoney, has recently been their best investigator, even though he's not paid to do that. He has indeed done reports where he can then send them to the Board of Elections and say, this is how many people we have found that have gone over the limit, particularly in the area of corporations, but across the board. So that clearly needs to be addressed. So I will leave it there, and I guess what I will say is public financing, by all means, indeed. We've already had my colleagues talk about why that's preferable. But you are not going to convince a public that they should give their tax dollars under whatever program unless there is accountability for their tax dollars. And if we can show them that there is effective reform and accountability in the reforming the current, what we call Article 14 of the election law, then we can convince them that your money will be used for what you want it used for, and that is to make sure that we have competitive elections, that we have a dynamic exchange of ideas, and that we elect the people that will be most responsive to the citizens of New York State. So I will leave it there, and I hope I stayed in the 5 minutes. And you can see what we think needs to be done. And I think I'm talking to the converted here. You need to write letters, and we go out and tell our members. They all have community newspapers in their districts. We want letters to the editor, and if you read the New York Times today, you saw a New York Times editorial, pretty much word for word what we're talking about today, advocating that. We would like all community newspapers to be doing the same thing. We would also, nothing quite as good as educating your own family and your neighbors, and clearly supporting the League's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. All right, thank you very much. Very good. First, I would be happy to entertain anybody's questions or comments and responses to each other. Anybody want to say anything? So, Michael.
Yeah, I'll pick up the gauntlet that Jeff threw down.
It was just a comment. It wasn't a gauntlet.
No, and we're friends. So this is fun. But Jeff said, and I'm going to only pick up one of the comments because it lets me, you know how you do it. You pick up the point that lets you make the point you want to make. He said politicians are going to be very resistant and therefore don't expect very much. And I'm going to take what he said and even go beyond it. He said, with all these independent expenditures coming up, he said, they're fearful and don't expect this to be easy. Not only do I agree with him on this point, but I think personally, and I'm not sure that everybody who likes public financing is with me on this, personally, I think they're right to feel a certain skepticism, because I think if I'm going to look at a campaign system, it's better when the politicians and the parties can make their case and are not drowned out by others who are less accountable. Now, I do think that independent expenditures have a much bigger potential role in lower visibility elections than higher visibility elections in Assembly or Senate than in presidency. But So when you talk about this kind of program, which is why I put the final chart on, when you talk about this kind of program, you have to say to people, you are not going to be a loser for doing this, that you will actually be better off if you have a mobilizable base of small donors who can give again and can be your volunteers and be your supporter in an election. They will be skeptical. It is a volunteer system, and what they'll see after 1 or 2 elections is that, in fact, it works for their colleagues, and then they will be less skeptical.
Okay. Any comments or any responses?
No, I would just add, as I said before, because and we know, I've been doing this for decades and decades, and legislators, this along with their, redistricting for one, ethics for another, but that's kind of a trifecta of what matters the most to legislators. This matters. So the only way to really get legislators to think that it's in their best interest to vote for this on the floor of the Assembly or the Senate, which is what has to happen, they have to be convinced that they do not do it at their own peril. That if they really want to get reelected, and they get elected in this state every 2 years, that their constituents are beginning to demand this. They won't feel that way unless there is a public outcry. And by the way, what we haven't mentioned at all today is the commitment by the Chief Executive, Andrew Cuomo. He has, Mr. Spitzer had a commitment, but he wasn't here long enough to do anything about it. So, but we have a commitment from this governor who has put it into a book when he was running as a candidate and has followed up with the State of the State. Now we have a new State of the State coming out in a couple of weeks, and we certainly are expecting and hopeful that there is going to be another mention of the campaign finance reform, along with a real campaign effort by the governor's office, along with a large coalition of people that will go forward, continue the education, and put enough pressure on legislators to change the view that I think many of us have had.
So this is good cop, bad cop. Barbara says we're going to beat them over their head, and I'm not going to say you shouldn't do that. I'm saying that you can actually show people that it's in their self-interest and that it's a voluntary program, and that there's actually there's actually a reward for coming in the system, and I actually think that's right.
Okay. Now, a lot of this is based, of course, in the New York City experience. Have we actually seen any evidence of changes in the way in which either elections or electoral competition, or ways in which candidates relate to their contributors in New York City? I know these laws have been in place for quite a while, so it's you may have to go some distance back. But is there any evidence that, as you say, Michael, the candidates representing the same place are raising a lot more money from small contributors compared to the candidates who are representing the same place in the state government? What do we know from any of this evidence about differences in politics or elections?
Yeah, let Adam.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like I'm stealing Michael's thunder, because much of the research has been done by the Campaign Finance Institute, and our organizations have collaborated together on some of this. But yes, as Michael said in his initial remarks, the evidence here is clear and it's unambiguous. The New York City system has seen an overall increase in the number of donors, so the number of citizens, the number of regular voters who are getting involved in supporting candidates with financial contributions has, in absolute terms, dramatically increased. And as Michael said, the diversity of those donors has increased as well. And so whereas the number of communities as represented by census block groups, which is, think of it as a city block, it's the easiest way to think of it. But if you look at those blocks that contribute to assembly candidates, it's relatively small, a modest number of them. And in, I think, about 90% of all the blocks in the city, you have contributors, at least one small contributor to a council candidate. So it's hugely, it is a much larger number and also a much more diverse group of donors that are getting involved in the system. And there's also been much more competition in terms of the number of unopposed candidates. If you look at candidates unopposed in the primary, candidates unopposed in the general election, there are more competitors for those seats in the city than there are at the state level. The Citizens Union just put out a study, either, I guess, last month, maybe the month before, but anyway, within the past couple of weeks, that looked in great detail at the number of contested seats. And the city system, because it allows candidates who lack either their own personal funds, like our mayor, Michael Bloomberg, or connections to deep-pocketed benefactors to run viable campaigns, it's also increased the number of candidates. So I think on all those measures, it's been a very serious success.
Okay.
Adam mentioned Mayor Bloomberg, and I want to bring him up because he always comes up in these conversations. He says, what do you mean? Public financing system didn't stop Mayor Bloomberg from spending $100 million. And it's true. And the absence of a public financing system also wouldn't have stopped him from spending $100 million. But because there was public financing, Bill Thompson had $7 million, he got up and well into the 40% range. He was able to be noticed. What it does is it increases the voice of those who don't otherwise have a strong voice. It doesn't stop the people who can already participate at a high level.
And I think something else that I think Adam may have brought up in his earlier remarks, I think we can't overlook not just the running of campaigns, and certainly we hope for a dynamic exchange of ideas, et cetera, but you can't overlook the governance that legislators, once they're in office, if they have the opportunity in a small period of time to pick up a telephone and talk to somebody, or somebody calls them and they need to return calls, who do you think they're going to return calls to? The guy or woman that gave them a $10,000 check, or someone that gave them $250. So if we can accomplish this, it takes that incentive away. And if you're around Albany during the session, you know that the fundraisers, and over 220 of them, I think at one point, per session that go on in the city of Albany, they are not for constituents. They are not and for Mr. Grisanti, it happens that he represents Buffalo, so I'm using him as an example, but he has a fundraiser here in Albany. His constituents aren't getting on a bus and coming across state to go to his fundraiser. Who is he raising money from here in the city of Albany? He's raising money from top flight lobbying firms, special interest, the moneyed special interest, and what influence will then they have when he goes onto the floor to issue a vote? And it's not just, it's all of them. And I see Mr. McEnany sitting back there. I think he can probably, legislators have limits on their time. It also limits on their time when they could be reading legislation, they're fundraising. And I think if you talk to most legislators, they hate doing it. They would much rather be thinking about ideas for reform in this state, whether it's economic or whatever they think their constituents need. So I think we can overlook the governance area of what big moneyed special interest does here in Albany.
Okay. Yes, Costas.
I'd like to respond to your question as well, looking at the New York City system, which has been in place since 1988, so we have a long track record to look at. And here again, I will reiterate some of what I said in my introductory remarks, which is that the evidence depends on what factor you look at, right? If you're looking at participation by small donors, as Michael had, I agree with you. There's no doubt that more of the money is coming from these small donors. I do think you do have to make that leap from that to the conclusion that therefore these people have more influence. I'm not unwilling to make that leap, but you do have to make that leap. But when you look at other dimensions of competitiveness, et cetera, and looking at an analysis that Jeff Krause did for the volume that I referred to earlier, if you compare what was going on before the introduction of public financing in New York City, you do see that there are more contested seats. So it is bringing candidates into the process. But for the most part, these are hopeless candidates that are unlikely to win. So if you look at levels of actual competitiveness, it really hasn't increased. In fact, there's more evidence that competition has declined in the post-public financing era than in the pre-public financing era. So there are probably more fundamental reasons for these developments. It doesn't seem that the public financing program in New York City has made our city elections or city council elections any more competitive, even though it's bringing more candidates into the process. And that also raises skepticism, I think, on the part of the public. Why, for lack of a better word, waste money on people who are unwilling to force the incumbents to be any more responsive or raise levels of responsiveness if they're basically, up against hopeless challengers anyway. It's unlikely to have any effect on how responsive they are.
Let me give a rejoinder here. So let's suppose that Jeff Krause's argument is totally accurate. We don't need to. If I were a lobbyist, which I'm not, the conclusion I would take from it is as follows. So if you enact public financing, we're not necessarily looking to throw you out of office because it won't make that much of a difference in that respect. Whether you get thrown out of office will depend upon other fundamental facts that make elections competitive. What we're out to do is to change your relationship with your constituents. It seems to me that's an easier sell than to tell somebody, we want you to vote for this because we want you to lose.
Yeah, we would agree. We would agree. And also, I think, and I don't know that that's been mentioned, but not only do we perhaps have more competitive elections, but the diversity of candidates certainly we hope will be a plus. Will there be more people of color? Will there be more, and maybe I'm not talking specifically about New York City, but certainly more women, more Asian Americans. We've seen for the first time in the last probably 8 to 10 years, we have some Asian American assembly members. I think we have, and I can't even tell you, I know whether she won, but did we have she ran, Grace Wong, she did win. Yeah. So we now have an Asian in Congress. So I think a public financing system is going to create a diversity in candidates that can only be more reflective of the population at large.
Adam, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to one thing that Costa said, which has to do with hopeless candidates or candidates. One of the criticisms of public financing that I've heard is, well, why are we going to, give this money to someone when we know the incumbents are going to win every time? I think the beauty of the design of the New York City type of system is that unlike a system where anyone who is able to qualify with some low threshold automatically gets a certain amount of taxpayer money, under a New York City matching system, the only public monies that are distributed to any candidates are distributed not as a result of opposition spending, but as a result of private contributions to those candidates. So candidates that don't have a lot of public support, as reflected by small contributions, aren't going to get a lot of public money. Unless you have private contributions flowing to the candidates, you're not spending much public money on those candidates. Conversely, when you have the only candidates who do receive substantial amounts of public funds are candidates who are successful in raising substantial numbers of private small contributions. And so I think the very nature of the design of the program is carefully calibrated to avoid wasting money on frivolous candidates who don't have any chance. Now, certainly there are candidates who are going to have a large base of support from 30 or 40% of a district and may not still be able to get over the top. But the notion that those candidates who get substantial public funds based on substantial support will not have a positive effect on the campaigns and engaging an incumbent in meaningful debate over the issues that affect the district, I think is inaccurate. And so I just wanted to highlight the way that the program functions to avoid too much of a concern about giving money to frivolous candidates.
So I want to, just a minute, I'm going to bother these people with a few other questions. Michael, some years ago, you had proposed, when we were writing together, that we strengthen political parties as a way of increasing political competition.
Sure.
Now, I don't know whether you're moving away from that, but are you shifting the mechanism, or are you shifting the goals of what you think a feasible campaign finance reforms should be? So, or have you changed your views at all on
No,
that?
I haven't changed my views.
Okay.
Strengthening political parties, obviously, in New York City, politics wouldn't do very much. It might help the workers, working families. But I do think it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Okay.
I do think the laws, especially the federal laws, create unnecessary regulatory burdens on state and local parties. I do think that there are ways to make it possible for parties to be more direct, to help candidates more directly. I don't want to speak in general and generically about political parties across all states and localities, because the rules governing them are so different. In New York State, where you're allowed unlimited contributions to one pot but not to another pot, and you're allowed transfers, it doesn't work the same way as it does elsewhere. When you walk into an assembly chamber in the state, and two people are standing in the room, and all of the lights go on as soon as a question is called, because the leaders have all the proxies for yay or nay. I don't think of that as a state where the weakness of the parties is the major problem. But in general, I think it's important and valuable for parties to be able to coordinate with candidates. I think it's also important for candidates to have an incentive not only to look at their parties, but also to look at their constituents. We don't have a parliamentary system. We have a system where people in legislatures represent constituents, then band together to form parties.
Okay.
Could I?
Yes, Jeff, please.
Just one comment. As a person who worked in campaigns for 25 years, all due respect, this constant presumption that candidates don't pay attention to their constituents. I have never seen a politician who isn't obsessed with what every group says, and all they wanted to know from me was, who does this group support me? Does this group support me? Does this group support me? Am I paying a price for this vote? Is that ad working against me? I just think that I appreciate, and I really will not disagree, that money is disturbing. But I think that the presumption that candidates do not pay attention to their constituents, even when they win 70-30, they do. They worry all the time. I just think it's a real, it's just not that simple. That's all.
Okay. All right.
Fair point.
Yeah.
All right. We have quite a few questions. Yes, sir. And please identify yourself.
Joel Margolis, private citizen. I'm not really too concerned if there are more constituents giving money, et cetera. I think the focus should be on the quality of government. I mean, for instance, why don't you look at the 25 years of the city council since we've had that, and the 25 years before? Is the quality of legislation or oversight better or worse? Or compare the period from, Gerald Ford to George W. Bush with the previous presidents. The quality there better or worse? Because if it isn't, I think it's irrelevant.
Any comments?
I think you're right.
Yeah, good point. So
I would answer that only in the effect that we do know here in New York, and I would gather the same in Washington, the people who give the large donations, nobody gives money they don't think they're going to get some return for. I mean, the banking industry does not give all of this money to federal candidates in hopes that they're just having an investment in that person. They want something from that legislator, and what they want are less regulations, and that's, let's just, that's banking. Let's take the insurance industry. There are certain things they want. Whatever it is, they don't give money out of their goodness of their heart. It's not a charity. They give money because they expect to get something in return. And I think you can see over the years, as the money's gone up, there have been hostage taking by one industry after another. Here in New York, we certainly have seen it, of what they get for the money they give.
I want to make a different kind of comment. There's a presumption built into the question, which is that one small process change needs to produce a fundamentally different government. And I think if anybody goes into any process reform with that expectation, he or she is bound to be disappointed. That's not going to happen. For example, there were claims made by people who were enacting the Watergate, the post-Watergate Federal Election Campaign Act, that would increase trust in government. And several wars and inflations and hostage takings later, lies by presidents and so forth and so on. It turns out that people had a little less trust in government. A lot less trust in government. Does that mean that the process reform didn't work? No, it meant that it was a ridiculous expectation in the first place. And if I'm going to argue that the city council's policies as a whole will change because of a change in this or that rule, that would be a ridiculous argument, and your point is well taken. But no process reform would matter. It wouldn't matter if you had a council manager form of government or a mayor form of government. Fundamentally, the economy is going to drive a lot of what happens. And I think we need to go into these with more modest expectations, clearer ones. That was Costas' point. And if you can't, in fact, show what happened against a measurable goal, then you're right. Then there's nothing there. And then you need to decide whether the goal is worthwhile or not. And I just think we shouldn't have utopian expectations, or to hold up utopia's expectations and say if they're not met, therefore anything that you do is worthless.
Very good. Mm-hmm. Costas, you had a
Yeah, I think
point?
those are all excellent points, but let me address a different assumption that's often involved in these conversations, which is that, the assumption that money is automatically corruptive. Right? I think we hear that a lot, and I'm not disagreeing that there are instances when contributions do corrupt politicians' views, and I think if we look at specific, we can find evidence of that. But what does the empirical evidence show across the board? Well, in looking at some of the scholarly literature on this question, there have been dozens of studies done of specific pieces of legislation, how PAC contributions in particular affect how legislators vote, et cetera. When we take dozens of those studies over a 25-year period and put them all together and analyze the effects, well, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that there does seem to be evidence of this quid pro quo in about 1 in 4 cases. But the good news is that in 3 out of 4 cases, there's no reliable evidence of a corruptive influence. So I do believe and agree with you, Barbara, that people who give money to politicians do expect to get something in return, but they don't always get it. And that is that's somewhat sobering to me.
All right.
I would just very quickly respond. One of the points I tried to make in the opening remarks is that trying to assess whether there's a corruptive influence based on whether a particular legislator voted for a piece of legislation or not, I think is an overly simplistic way of assessing what corruption of government or disproportionate influence wielding in government looks like. And so it may be that from a causation or even a correlation standpoint, sort of some of the sociological research has not been able to prove a corruptive influence based on particular PAC contributions. I don't think that rules out the notion that there is distortion of the issues on which legislatures engage and the agendas that they pursue, which is correlated or which is influenced by the patterns of spending.
Or other things
Another way
access
of putting that, Costas, is that nobody who's going to listen to to someone who asks a favor is going to put it up to a visible roll call vote. This is about what amendments are allowed or not allowed, and the way commas are put in legislation. It's not about roll call votes, which are generally driven by party and ideology and constituency.
But that said, I don't mean to make the suggestion that any contribution, any money is inherently corrupting in an irredeemable way. I mean, I think that the basis of a system like New York City's is that, in fact, small contributions, relatively limited contributions, are not something we need to worry about corrupting, and that, in fact, by engaging folks financially, particularly at low levels for folks that otherwise are not engaged, we're likely to get more active citizens in caring about policy and caring about government. And so the studies that have looked at folks giving $50, $100 small contributions, and whether they're displaying yard signs, whether they're volunteering, whether they're passing out campaign literature or making phone calls at a volunteer bank, those sorts of things are correlated to having a small financial stake in a candidate's campaign, and I think those are very good and healthy for democracy. And so I don't mean to suggest that I think any money in the system is a bad thing. And in some ways, I think that, to me at least, represents sort of a shift, a fundamental shift in thinking about public financing, which historically, in some cases at least, was looked at as a way to get money out. Money's all bad, let's get money out. We'll just give a big block of untainted, clean money to everyone, versus the way this small donor matching system works, which is much less about eliminating money, squeezing from the top, as Michael referred to earlier, and more about building up the base, bringing people in. So I think that's an important distinction to make about what we're doing.
And what we would certainly hope is that with people more involved in participatory democracy, it will increase our voter turnout, which we know is, I think we're 38th now in the United States as far as voter turnout, and it may very well be that people don't feel they're invested, and it's just, it's those big money folks that my vote doesn't matter. So what we're also hoping is that you can increase voter turnout along with participatory democracy.
Yeah, let me take this to an extreme other end of the financial spectrum. I don't think that David and Charles Koch, who put $50 million or more into this election, are doing so for corrupt reasons. I think they're doing so because they care about the country, and I don't think fundamentally that the idea of giving lots of money to people, to voter mobilization organizations, or creating think tanks, great, do it. Come in, as I've heard one say about someone else, take it or spend it all. To me, the issue is that people and parties, but especially people who run, need to have alternatives and additional sources. If that's not their constituency, they have to be able to develop another one. So I don't buy the idea that although I do buy that some, I don't buy that all or even a lot of the really big money out there is fundamentally corrupt money.
Right. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Kathy Coburg, and I come from Malta. I have a little group of people. We call ourselves Democracy is for People. We're a subsidiary of Public Citizen, I guess. And my question is about all these different campaign finance mechanisms that you talk about, campaign finance reform mechanisms throughout the country. Do any of them say that no money can come into the candidates from outside of their constituency?
No existing ones say that. Every time it's been proposed, people from poor constituencies have resisted it. One interesting system, a new multiple matching fund for small donor system in the city of Los Angeles, which hasn't been around. The system is only in place now, so we haven't studied it. They give an extra bonus for in-district money over out-of-district money. It's not a prohibition. In fact, there are some people who would argue that you could make that might be unconstitutional to prohibit out-of-district money. But to give a bonus for it, one of the nice things about federalism is we will have lots of systems and we can study them and
I guess
see
my
it works.
point is when we're talking about all these independent expenditures, and they're coming from people. Now they're going to start looking, as Professor Stonecash said, they're going to be looking at very close races that maybe be under the wire. This is money being sent in that really doesn't have any responsibility to the people in that area.
Could I just add that?
Yeah.
What if you follow campaign finance, and when a report is due at Friday at 5 o'clock, the opponents are standing there at the desk saying, "I want a copy," and they look it over the weekend. And if you take $5,000 from some bad group, I promise you, it'll be in an ad. So every time one of those possibilities exists, the candidate really sits down with other people and says, "Should I take this? What are the drawbacks? Who can go after me?"
Do they have a requirement to give that in by Friday at a certain time? Because
yeah.
as we find in New York State,
Oh, yes,
a lot of
yes.
times they're not reporting,
Only
right?
if it's covered by disclosure laws.
Yes.
Right.
And the kind of money you've just referred to, the outside money parachuting in, an increasing percentage of it is not covered. And that's why Barbara Bartoletti talked about the importance of strengthening disclosure laws.
Yeah, and what we would actually like to see is almost, as you get closer to the election, almost 24-hour disclosure. Jeff probably would come unglued because he'd probably get no sleep.
No,
what he used to do. But
Send a lackey to do this.
but that's what we think would be ultimate, so that the voter actually knows who is giving to this person and who might have undue influence once he or she is elected.
In the back, please.
Hi, I'm Barbara Murphy, League of Women Voters. Question, given the intransigence of elected officials to initiate a change toward public funding, is there any research on the places that have done it, and was it an individual or group, or what was the impetus for the change to a public funding system, not only New York City, but Connecticut and Arizona and a few other places that have it?
Minnesota got it?
Minnesota.
Yeah, Minnesota was legislative. Arizona, Maine were by initiative. Connecticut was by a legislator after a governor was put in jail. And Los Angeles was by city council. It varies. An initiative would seem in some ways to be easier, but they're
We don't have that
both
here in
ways.
this state.
They come in both legislative and initiative form.
I guess that's the frustration, knowing that we've been pushing for reforms for decades, as you indicate. We need to find the button to push to get something done locally, and apparently we haven't found it yet, so I'm trying to look for...
And even with the 15 or so legislators that have had ethical lapses and gone off to jail, it hasn't been, as far as we know, it's been illegality, bribery, fraud, whatever. It has not been because of campaign finance reform. However, we wouldn't really know if it did because we have such ineffective enforcement in this state.
I should also say, just to turn it back to the questioners, one of the weaknesses when we were studying campaign finance reforms in the states back in the 1990s, and many of these reforms, was that they often were enacted and fairly static after some sort of major scandal. And the couple of consequences resulted from that. One, in terms of the regulations, they didn't adjust to new campaign finance realities, and so they didn't really have the same effects as they did when they were initially enacted. And secondly, and this gets back to the question of campaign public financing, a lot of the funding sources sort of depleted or degenerated rather quickly. Checkoffs, for example, usually declined in states over time, and there wasn't an alternative source. In fact, one of the few states that countered that was Minnesota, but Minnesota always seemed to have a sort of a base of political support for campaign finance reform, and it had to be used several times in order to maintain financial support for their programs. I don't know whether you. So there's a problem with just using the big event, the scandal and something else, or other big events to produce a reform, because campaign finance reform usually wasn't a one-time thing if it was going to work. I don't know if anybody had any comments on that.
Well, actually, and I don't think, we didn't discuss it today, and I'm not sure because we're not quite there yet, but there have been some proposals kind of put around in the Albany, atmosphere about how you would actually have a fair election and how it would be consistently funded, a combination of resources, perhaps not just taxpayer dollars, but other resources that would provide a steady stream of funding. And I think those have yet to be fully developed, but we're not probably there yet.
Look, the theoretical and not the fully developed proposal way of saying this is that if you shove a program down the throat of a reluctant legislator, you can feel pretty sure that the legislator will try to neuter the agency that's and by cutting its funds and so forth.
Right.
What's vital to make the thing happen over time, and this happened in Minnesota, is to have a constituency, a positive constituency among legislators of both parties. And in Minnesota, 75% of the Republicans still take public funding.
I think Michael is becoming a politician and not just a reformer.
Political scientist.
Part of it.
Right.
Straightforward public administration.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Russ Haven with NYPIRG. Just to add to what was said, one of the reasons the New York City system has not only been popular, but it's been enhanced over time is because they do a voter's guide. So there's public evidence of what the tax monies are being used for, and certain candidates have to engage in debates if they're part of the system. So, and the New York City Campaign Finance Board is very visible and very active, engaging New York City residents, and in comparison to, let's say, the New York State Board of Elections, which is more or less moribund when it comes to public education. So,
okay, very good. Yes, ma'am, and then
Jessica Wisniewski with Citizen Action of New York. I wanted to agree with Jeff very much on Citizen Action we push for campaign finance, public financing elections, but we also engage in the electoral process with candidates. And I totally agree with you that candidates absolutely and elected officials absolutely care about their constituents. Mm-hmm. It's very deep connection because the votes and the money are the two things they need, right? And I think that this system is the matching fund system where my $10 donation becomes a $60 donation is the perfect marrying of the two. For a candidate, it's no longer my voters I must care about over here and the big money sitting on the phone in a little room making, dialing for donors. Those two things merge, and I think that's a really powerful part of this program. My actual question might be to Adam or maybe Professor Malbin, or others who think of this from a national perspective. Are there any other very popular governors across the United States who have called for a massive, comprehensive campaign finance reform? And if New York State and Governor Cuomo can pull this off in 2013, what impact do you think that would mean for the nation?
You can do that.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, there aren't too many. If there are any others out there, I'm not really aware of any other governors who have both the popular support and have actually been vocal on this issue. if New York could actually pull this off, where there has been a lot of attention to this is at the federal level. There are currently before the Congress, before the House, at least 3 proposals for public financing. Representative Sarbanes has an interesting one that's based on a multiple match, a sort of 2-track multiple match system. Representatives Price and Van Hollen have another proposal, also based on a multiple match. There's a fair elections bill, and there's yet another bill that's being, or concept of a bill that's being shopped around by others, including Larry Lessig, which is a more comprehensive anti-corruption act. So there's a lot of attention to this at the federal level. I don't think there's a lot of folks thinking it's going to be the first thing passed in January in Congress, or even the second or third. But I think to see a big, important, influential state like New York actually moving forward seriously with an ambitious agenda on public financing would be a huge shot in the arm for efforts at the federal level, and would also certainly provide a model for other states around the country. And so I think Governor Cuomo, but the state in general, has an incredible opportunity right now to show that kind of national leadership. I don't think the country always looks to Albany for inspiration as far as leadership on ethical government processes, but this is an incredible opportunity. But I just wanted to follow up also just on the first part of your comment, which was echoing Jeff's observations. I completely agree. I don't think there's too many elected officials out there that aren't obsessed with what their constituents think of them. And I think Mayor Bloomberg, who, to bring that example up again, he's not probably going to run for mayor again unless we redo the term limit again. But when he had potential re-election bids, I'm sure he was following the polling number. I'm sure he was as obsessed with what kind of poll results he was getting, what his constituents thought, as much as anybody else. And he wasn't doing it because he was worried about being able to raise money from them. Politicians, like you say, they're going to need the votes, but they're also going to need the money. And right now, there's only 2 ways they can get the money. One is to be named Michael Bloomberg, in which case they don't have to worry about it. And frankly, we don't need to worry about campaign contributions corrupting somebody that can spend $100 million of their own money. But the only other way right now, if you lack that money yourself, is to raise money in the kinds of levels that you can compete against potentially well-funded opposition, and more realistically now, well-funded outside unaccountable groups that can come in and sort of firebomb your race and spend millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars against you. And to do that under the current system requires collecting money from lobbyists, really courting that small 0.1% of donors that do that, who are very tied in with the lobbying industry and various interest groups. And what this would do is create a third way. It would create a path for a candidate that didn't have money to begin with and was not either skilled at or comfortable with raising money from the sort of lobbying industrial complex, and give them an opportunity to raise money by doing voter outreach, reaching out to their constituents in their districts, around the city, around the state, and raising money in small increments, and then have a non-corrupting pot of money that they could use to mount a viable campaign.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to have to do quick answers and
one quick
questions.
comment.
Okay.
I do think people ought to worry a little bit about unintended consequences here of public finance, because if you think it's hard to get members of a legislature to agree now, and you talk about dysfunction and paralysis, if I was a member of Congress and I could get my own money with no influence from John Boehner, I think I might become even more independent of John Boehner. And if you've been following it, he has got the class of 2010, there were 81 of them, I think, 73 survived. I want you to all note that their vote percentage went from 56% to 62%. That crazy group of people elected in 2010, all right? So they're going to go to John Boehner, and he's going to say, we got to compromise. They're going to go to hell. I did better in a year which was pro-democratic. So if you give them independent financing, they are going to become even more difficult for John Boehner to get to do anything. So I don't know what will happen, but I don't think it's, when you talk about national consequences, I don't think it's so clear that all these things are going to work like everybody thinks. It's got some real positive features. Don't No, I don't want to disagree with that, but you do wonder about, if you've ever talked to the Speaker of the Assembly, they will tell you, everybody says they're in charge of everything, and they will say, oh yeah, you try to herd cats?
Right.
So I just think
Mike, did you have a-
it's not so clear.
Oh, you had a question in
Right,
the back.
conference.
In the corner.
Yes, Mr. McEnany.
Jack McEnany, Assemblyman for the rest of the month. 47 years in public life, and I've been at least a department head, originally in the county since 1969, and held a number of other jobs, and I've been elected for the last 21 years. And the first year was to do a sneak attack on the majority leader of the county legislature. It wound up in a disputed tie, and I then got elected in a write-in. And I'm still not forgiven for that one. The last 20 years I've been in the state assembly, and I have to agree with some of the things that were said here. I do think that politicians do worry very much. They'll get 20 favorable letters of praise and one criticism. They'll spend the whole day worried about the one letter and forget the 20. And they care very much about what their constituents think of them. They also hate fundraising. It's a rare person that actually enjoys it. And they would much rather govern and legislate than play dialing for dollars. And I think money is corrupting the American system. I know we're getting near the anticipated deadline, but having been around this for a long time, I remember how things were very, very different. I remember the days of the machine government and 2 committeemen active in every election district, and there was a lot of shoe leather and door knocking. And I remember when we established the county executive in Albany County, something that the League of Women Voters was very active in. And the county clerk ran against the county treasurer in a primary, and then came out of that, and there was a Republican and an independent, which was the one that lost, the Democrat and the regular Democrat. And that individual, Jim Coyne, was at 54 public forums, meet the candidate, debates, you name it, where one or both of his opponents were there. I don't think in the last couple of years we've seen more than maybe one debate for mayor, one debate for county executive. The whole style has changed. And what we have seen is an absolute saturation of targeted mail, which was not possible before the computer age. If you want to send a letter to women of childbearing age who vote in 3 out of the last 4 primaries, you can do it, but it costs money, because you have to figure out how to do it. You have to buy the software. There's more and more hired professionals who are running campaigns. The cost of campaigns are enormous. Now, I agree with the 3 out of 4 pillars that the League of Women Voters put up there on full disclosure and limits on what can be given and all those these are not controversial issues. But the last one of public financing, sort of put your money where your mouth is, taxpayer, I think maybe it's marketed wrong. And I think a lot of people, for philosophical, not political reasons, think that this is a state that constitutionally says you can't give taxpayers' dollars to private individuals. We certainly lean on that a lot of times for different things, but there's something fundamentally disorienting to taxpayers on it. Now, in New York City, which is so dependent upon primaries, I think some people think that's a great job for school teachers in the summer. They can run a campaign for somebody, and come September, the primary's over, they go back and they teach school. And I did have to agree, and I think it was Costas mentioned it, how competitive are these races? We can say we've had more contested races. Well, how many of them really had credible candidates? And we put no real threshold on it other than the ability to raise money. So if you can go to a family with 10 people and Papa writes the check, tell them to write 11 or 10 checks, and we'll say there's more people involved. And are they? I don't know. But I think if we were to look at public money, it should go into enforcement. We have horrible enforcement at every level of government. What a pain in the neck to fill out all these forms and then nobody reads them, and you write a complaint, nobody does anything about it. So enforcement, that's where public taxpayer money should go. It's an obligation of the state and of government. I think somebody mentioned the publications that come around, Taxpayers or Citizens Guide in New York City. California has that. So when you're being saturated with very expensive television commercials, one after the other, about a week before the election, if a mailing comes out, and it could be done by email, but a mailing would have to go at a minimum to those who wanted it, where you could sit with coffee in the morning and read something from every candidate. Here's what I've done. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I'd like to do in the future, and sit down without the soothing voice of the World War II veteran or the concerned soccer mom's voice, or no voice at all from the candidate. You notice that voiceovers are more popular. You might be making better decisions. I think there's extraordinary hypocrisy in the media, and particularly in the newspapers. Did anybody ever look at the cost of an ad in a daily newspaper? It's just extraordinary. Now, the Spotlight, I remember, which is a weekly, would contact you in advance saying, we're going to put your picture in, we're going to let you make a statement, you're going to put in, you've got so many column inches, and by the way, we're doing the same for your opponent, and by the way, it's free. Now, that's a commitment to campaign finance reform, and people keep those weekly newspapers, almost always in the suburbs. They keep them for a week, they put them to one side, they understand something about it. I think there's tremendous hypocrisy on it. The debates, almost non-existent. If we had campaign financing, we ought to be able to contract with the school district or the library and have 3 debates. And you know what? If there's an empty chair because you didn't show, too bad. Sometimes I sarcastically say, and I've usually outspent, and in some cases by a great deal, in one case lost, but I think shameless manipulation of the press used to be the joke. Somebody who would actually communicate and be available to every newspaper because you needed it desperately. We have politicians whose phones are not listed in the phone book. We have people who don't give out their cell phone. We have people who have paid help issuing statements for them. There's a lot of people, and then what do they do when they campaign? They buy as many ads as they possibly can and drown out the opposition. So I think when we talk about money, giving it to a private individual to run for office is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And by the way, I'm on that bill, and I'm a sponsor, and if it happens, it's great. But I think we also have to look and think, where should we be spending public money? Should there be voters' guides? Should there be sponsored debates? Should we get cooperation or perhaps buy cooperation at a reduced rate from newspapers? And should we, when somebody comes in, should we help them set up a web page for every single valid candidate so we can reach out to the people who, as the next generation, more and more people are in cyberspace? Do we make it easy for people to run, to make them available, or do we protect the person who just simply hides, buys consultants, buys ads, saturates the airwaves, and that's it? So I think we could spend our money, some of it better than giving it to a candidate, by giving it to our boards of elections to have proper enforcement and notification for voters. Thank you.
I just wanted, Jack really isn't a plant for us, but the voter's guide, so-called, the league does do that. We have something called Vote 411. All of the candidates are up on that if they choose to give us that information. Mostly challengers give us that information, not incumbents. But it's up there in cyberspace. You can get to it from our website, and it was there for the previous election. The league also does, as you know, candidates debates, and as many as candidates that we can get to tell us they will do it, we will sponsor a candidates debate, and we have 50 leagues statewide. So we do a couple of those things. I don't think it quite comes to the level of making sure that there's more responsive and more money from small donors in the political system.
Oh,
lets you, there's one group that asks you to fill out an extremely elaborate form that takes 2 hours to do. And if you turn it off and start all over, you got to start all over completely. And then if you don't do it, they say no response.
Yeah.
You know, that's elitist. That's elitist.
So, Mr. McNamara, so there are a lot of ways in which a government can equally provide in-kind help to candidates and parties. And people will disagree over a particular program, such as small donor matching. But I personally think all of those ideas are good, like with energy policy, all of the above.
Okay. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you very much. Let's thank our panelists.